Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Vinyl Den, your channel for record collecting by record collectors. I'm Nick. Today, I'm talking about the life and legacy of the late great Ozzy Osbourne and what I think are his top 5 albums from his career. The last one might surprise you. There's a bunch of links down below. You got links for the Vinyl Den Facebook group, for the merch page, for the Spotify and Apple Music playlist that I put together every week, and the Patreon page. So make sure you check all that out. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button down below, and make sure you hit that notification bell so you're notified every time I release new episodes. So when I heard of Ozzy's passing on Tuesday, like a lot of people out there, I was shocked by it. You know, he just had the big live show, the concert, a week and a half ago, wrapping up his live career. At first, I wasn't going to make a video just because I didn't want to be seen as someone just jumping on the bandwagon. But his music has had such a profound impact on my life. Not only what he meant to me, but his legacy in music and how he's been one of the most significant musicians of the last 60 years. Of course, Ozzy helped create Black Sabbath back in 1968, and in doing so would create an entirely new genre of music. With other bands like Black Sabbath in the late 60s and early 70s that were making music like Sabbath, yes, but Sabbath was the band that brought that to the mainstream, brought that to the masses, and would go on to influence every other metal band, from the early 70s all the way up until today. And then after leaving Black Sabbath, he would go on to become one of the biggest solo musicians of the 80s and early 90s, with all 7 of his first solo albums all going multi-platinum. And then in 2006, Ozzy Osbourne would be inducted in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame with Black Sabbath. And for the last several years, whenever I talk about the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, I would always talk about how it was wrong that Ozzy wasn't inducted as a solo musician also. But finally in 2024, that happened, even though it took way too long for him to be inducted. And also outside of music, Ozzy helped pioneer a new style of reality TV in the early 2000s with the Osbournes, which for me quickly became must-see TV every single week. And in the 90s, Ozzy was turned down by the organizers of Lollapalooza, so what would he do? He'd go on to create his own music festival, Ozzfest, which would dominate for the next couple of decades. Starting in 1996, it was one of the biggest music festivals every single year up until it ended in 2018. I think Ozzy is easily one of the most iconic musicians of his era, alongside artists like Jim Morrison, Freddie Mercury, David Bowie, Elvis, Prince, Tom Petty, all the biggest musicians of the last 60 years. Ozzy deserves to be right up at the top with all the rest of them. And honestly, there will never be another musician like Ozzy Osbourne. So I was never a big metal fan, but I grew up listening to Black Sabbath. I was probably maybe 10 or 11 years old when I found my dad's record collection, and he had a copy of Paranoid Volume 4 in there, and I would listen to those things nonstop. And so Black Sabbath was my entry point into Ozzy's music career. I love all those Ozzy-era Black Sabbath albums, even Never Say Die and Technical Ecstasy. I know people love to hate on those albums, but I think there's some really good music on those last 2 albums. Music was really changing at that point in the 70s, and Sabbath was trying to find their place in the music scene. And while I think, yes, those are probably the 2 weakest albums of that era from Sabbath, there's still a lot of really good stuff across both those albums. But as far as Ozzy's solo career goes, I would say for the longest time I was more of a casual fan of his music. Yes, I knew all the big hits from across his albums, but it probably wasn't until, I'd say within the last probably 10 or 15 years, that I really started to fall in love with the solo albums. And I think for the most part it was just because it was hard for me to hear Ozzy and not hear all the other guys from Sabbath playing behind him. And over the years I've gained a whole new appreciation for his music. And even though the bands I was in the 90s and early 2000s, we didn't play a style close to what Sabbath did or what Ozzy did in his solo career, that music definitely had a huge impact on me and my playing style. It's always hard to watch your icons age, and for the last several years, it's been hard to watch Ozzy suffer the way he has. Ever since his back injury and his surgeries, he hasn't been able to be the musician that he's wanted to be. So, as hard as it may be, it's nice to know Ozzy is finally at peace. And even though Ozzy may no longer be with us, his music will live on forever. And it was great to see that Ozzy was able to do what he loved doing up until the very end. Just earlier this month doing the Back to the Beginning concert where it was the final show of Sabbath, it was the final show of Ozzy's career. And I think it was a great final tribute to not only the greatness of Ozzy Osbourne, but also Black Sabbath. But I also wanted to talk about what I think are Ozzy's 5 best albums. And I'm going to start at 1 and go to 5 just because I think there's some really obvious ones that most people are going to have up there at the very top. But the album I got at number 5 might surprise some people. And the album that I've got at number 1 is one that probably a lot of people out there have also. It was the album that started the whole thing, and that was Blizzard of Oz from 1980. It was Ozzy's debut solo album. It was also the first album with Randy Rhoads. And with Blizzard of Oz, he would not only cement his post-Sabbath legacy, but he would also reinvent his entire career. And Blizzard of Oz is one of those albums where, it could be a greatest hits compilation in and of itself. There's so many classic tracks on this album from beginning to end. And, Randy Rhoads really stands out on this album, really puts on a masterclass in guitar playing. The album was a massive commercial success. It would hit number 21 on the Billboard 200. It would sell, I think, 5 or 6 million copies here in the US. And the album would produce instant classics like Crazy Train, Mr. Crowley, Suicide Solution, Goodbye to Romance. A lot of those songs would become staples in his live shows moving forward. And then the album I got number 2 is another one I think a lot of people would have up there towards the top. And that is Diary of a Madman from 1981. It was his second solo album. It was also the second album with Randy. And in some ways, I think this is kind of a darker, more complex album than what he did on Blizzard of Oz. I never thought Randy could top what he did on Blizzard of Oz, but I think musically on Diary of a Madman, in some ways, it was a little more tighter. It was a little more in tune, I think, what Ozzy was trying to do on this album. And unfortunately, Randy died 5 months after this album came out, so we never got to see how great they could have been together. And even today, I think Over the Mountain is probably one of the best opening tracks Ozzy ever had on any of his albums. It's just whenever I listen to this album, I always think to myself, what could have been had Randy survived, what they could have done together, in the years to come. I will say, I think it is kind of odd that Randy Rhoads was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, 3 years before Ozzy made it in. And I get it. Randy played with Quiet Riot also. He did other things outside of these 2 albums, but there's such a strong connection between Randy and Ozzy that he would go in without Ozzy is kind of strange. The album I got number 3 is a little bit different of an album for Ozzy, and that was No More Tears from 1991. It was his 6th album. It was also his 2nd album with Zakk Wylde on guitar. And in some ways, it's a little more of a more polished, a little more like radio-friendly kind of style from Ozzy. I think the strength of those 2 songs helped propel this album into directions Ozzy had never gone in his career. And in many ways, this is Ozzy's defining album from his career in the 90s. Something I didn't learn until years later was that 6 of the songs off this album were actually co-written by Lemmy, including some of the biggest tracks on this album. And even as someone who was more of a casual Ozzy fan when this album came out, this is one I bought on cassette shortly after it came out and listened to it a bunch of times over the years. This for the longest time was my favorite album from him. The album I got at number 4, if you would have asked me 6 or 7 years ago, I probably wouldn't have had it in my top 5. It's definitely grown on me over the last few years. I slept on this album for way too long, and I, have come to realize the brilliance of it. But it was released in 1988, and that's No Rest for the Wicked. I don't know why I didn't listen to this album for the longest time, but like I said, over the last several years, I've really grown to appreciate this album. It's a little more raw, a little more like riff-driven kind of album. This was also the first album with Zakk Wylde on guitar, and I think this album really showcases his strengths as a guitar player. And in some ways, this is the album that kind of reinvigorated his career, and what he would do on No Rest for the Wicked would really lay the foundation for what he would do on his next several albums. I really don't think he could have had No More Tears without No Rest for the Wicked. And honestly, over the last probably year or two, this has become one of my most played albums from Ozzy. Maybe that's because I haven't listened to it as much as I have, say, Blizzard of Oz, but I love this album. And whenever his best albums are discussed, I think this album always deserves to be up in that discussion with the other ones. All right, so the album I got number 5. This is the one that probably will surprise some people out there. I've never understood why this album gets the hate that it does, but it was released in 2007, and that is Black Rain. It was Ozzy's 10th album, and this was actually the first album with Zakk Wylde back on guitar since Down to Earth in 2001, and it would be his last album with Ozzy until Patient Number 9. I remember when this album came out, fans gave this album very mixed reviews. I would say most of the reviews I read about this album were negative. I think it's something that really impacted me listening to this album, because it wasn't until, several years after this album came out that I finally listened to it. And for an album this far into a musician's career, I think this album was surprisingly musically diverse, and it showed that at this point, Ozzy was still capable of making a really great album. Is Black Rain Blizzard of Oz? No. But, I think it's still a really good album. It's one that I think is a lot better than a lot of people say it is. And with the return of Zakk Wylde for this album, it was a return to a little more of a darker, heavier sound from Ozzy. And commercially, it still do really well. It hit number 3 on the Billboard 200. It would go gold here in the US. And I also credit Black Rain as being that album that really kicked off that incredible streak to end Ozzy's career with this album, Scream, Ordinary Man, and Patient Number 9. So if you're an Ozzy fan and you haven't listened to this album in a long time, it's a good one to give another chance to. Well, that's all I get for you today, guys. Thanks for checking the show out. Make sure you drop me a comment down below. Let me know what you guys think are the best albums from Ozzy's career. Of course, it's always hard to lose an icon like Ozzy Osbourne, but, I wanted to get on here and talk about what his music meant to me, as I'm sure it meant a lot to a lot of other people out there. But, I don't know, let me know what you guys think. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up. Hit the subscribe button down below. That's all I got. Until next time, keep on spinning. Peace.